Hey guys, I'm Mike, and I'm gonna go over what it takes to kind of build just a random shell like this Mark III into a rear-wheel drive drift car. So in this case, I'm putting a BMW V8 in it and basically cutting everything else out to make it work. The first step was grabbing a shell. So I grabbed the shell off of a coworker. He pulled the motor for a swap and just had it sitting in his backyard under a tree. It took a bunch to clean it out. It had kind of grown a bunch of stuff on it over the years, and there are actually trees growing in the cowl section. But after that, kind of got an assessment of where we needed to be. Next step was pulling the engine. I used an M62 that I actually had in my E34 before. I had swapped it into that. Long story short, that car is going for a little more power these days. So I was pulling the V8 out to put a bigger engine in anyway. So this engine was just going to be free to do whatever. So this is an early BMW M62 non-Vanos, which is the 4.4 liter aluminum block V8. It's roughly like 280 horse from the factory. This one has 290,000 miles on it. In my E34, it did, I think, 275 wheel. So it's still all right. It'll hang on through this, and it's definitely worth saving, but no one's gonna buy it with that high of miles. So with the engine free, sitting around, and the car pretty much ready to go, it was time to just strip everything out, strip all the suspension. I wasn't gonna be using any of the Mark III stuff because it's a front-wheel drive setup, so the subframe is gonna be in the way. The steering rack was too high up. So I just pulled all the suspension out from under it and just started with the bare shell. At that point, I noticed it was actually pretty rusty, so wasn't super worried about it at that point. And, just kind of came to cut everything mode, cut all the rust out and just make space to redo everything fresh. So just cut the firewall out. These actually unbolt, but they're glued in. So I pulled out the front panel and then cut the floor out to get enough space to get the transmission further back. Kind of did a bunch of measuring and test fitting. The main concerns I had with this is I wanted the engine essentially as high up as you can get it, because Volkswagens are normally pretty low. So I wasn't really worried about center of gravity, but just mounting it as high as I can and still have the hood shut. I'd rather not have an engine hanging out of the hood. Once the engine I kind of had freely mounted in space, was time to do the subframe. So basically I ended up having to front half the car. I basically cut off right behind the strut tower and did tube from there out. That gave me nice locations to then mount my own subframe and make something new to hold both the engine and the control arm mounts. In this case, I'm retaining the Mark III knuckles. I cut them quite a bit to get this much steering angle, but I needed enough space for the wheel to be full cut and not get into this inner frame horn here. So the control arms are quite a bit longer than they would have been and mount completely differently. The steering rack is actually a Nissan 240 S13 chassis steering rack. Basically just something I had sitting around. Made it easy to mount because it's also a rear steer rack, which is the tie rod mounting location being behind the pivot point of the knuckle, essentially at the control arm location. Figured out the geometry quickly, mounted up with these nice Bilstein PSS 9s, and kind of cycled everything, make sure I had space. We ran some Turner camber plates we had sitting around that I adapted to these Bilsteins. The front towers were already a little rusty, and the front mounts didn't give me any camber adjustment. So I just cut out the whole assembly and made new plates and then welded those into the car. So that's all finally mounted. So in this car, I'm running a Ford 8.8 rear end, which this version is out of an Explorer, which is the larger 31 spline axle shafts. They're really rugged and dirt cheap. I think I paid $100 for this one. So it's kind of ideally what I need for this type of build. With everything rusty back there, kind of just cut everything out to make space. Threw some wheels on it quick and tried to see how far it would go up. Realizing it was going to hit the frame rails, so I ended up C-notching that out to give the axle enough clearance to go up. With that figured out, I had to move on to the 4-link stuff. So, you know, once the axle is located and in the notches as far as I predicted travel to be, start figuring out the suspension linkage for that. I tried to figure it out with 100% anti-squat, which is no translation under load for the tires to either push down or suck up into the chassis. I want it to stay neutral in that case. So I kind of did some rule of thumb measurements, nothing super exact, just kind of ballparked it. Should be close, we'll have to see how it does. But just kind of mounted up links, cycled it a couple times, and then once I was happy with it, welded it in. With the axle located, the next major issue was, you know, there's no floors in it. We cut everything out that was rusty, so kind of starting from scratch, which is nice and also a lot of work. I ended up just making cardboard templates for the panels, just kind of figuring out a path I needed it to be, making a cardboard template, trimming it all to fit, tracing that onto a piece of sheet metal, then, you know, bead rolling edges in it so it doesn't resonate like a drum, and it kind of gives the panel some rigidity. Then tacking everything in. I worked from the back in this case, over the rear axle, worked my way forward towards the tunnel. I also had to make the headers before finishing up the tunnel just to make sure I had space rather than have the exhaust too low and potentially drag it on stuff. So wrapped all that up. The floors are all, at this point, complete. So for the cage on this, I kind of went a little overboard. You don't really need this much of a cage for drifting, but I kind of am a nerd about cage work and sort of enjoy it. So I went a little over the top. I've got a bunch of X's going in to keep the car rigid. The other thing is this car was, you know, pretty rusty and a little bit floppy. So I wanted the cage to be, you know, just as much for safety as for chassis rigidity. So, you know, I've got a really tight B-pillar situation with a bunch of integrated X's in the back, as well as the roof, and pretty rugged door bars. Everything's tied in through the firewall to the front strut towers and down to the rear strut towers, bringing the whole chassis together and keeping it nice and rigid, as well as giving me a nice, you know, passenger compartment that'll stay nice and safe. So, like, you know, a lot of the higher end drift cars, I decided to go with a rear mounted radiator. It wasn't a complete necessity, but I thought it'd be fun, and, you know, front space is getting a little tight with the V8. The rockers were already off in this case because they were pretty rusty, so I cut all that out. We got nice replacements from Clocker Home. So before I welded those in, I hard piped some steel tube down both side rockers for, you know, inlet and outlet of the radiator back up to the engine. So that way I'm not trapped in the passenger compartment with hot coolant tubes and they're not dangling under the car. So all that's nicely tucked away. And then I mounted this nice CSF radiator that we got. In this case, I ordered a Jeep XJ radiator because they're nice and wide and really low. So I should have plenty of cooling capacity. It fits really nice back here. Pretty happy with how that came out. The next hurdle was really to get air into that CSF radiator. You know, the rear of the car doesn't generally flow a lot of air. So I have fans mounted in both front sections of the quarter panel. And then I've been working on ducting since to get that fresh air across the radiator, and then I still have to duct the rest of the way out. But that was the last couple pieces to make this a rolling chassis, really to tie it together so I could put the rockers back on. It was all this radiator mounting and coolant tube situation. So on this car, I'm running 18 by 9 inch Alzors, which is an ECS brand that we carry. They're a little big for a Mark III in my opinion, but this car was rusty enough in the arches where it'd honestly make it easier if I cut the arches out and then did, you know, a bolt-on flare to kind of make up the difference between the wheel and covering up some rust at the same time. So those bolt-on flares are on now. Cut everything out, welded the inner fender back up so it's nice and sealed. Oh, and the other thing I almost forgot is I added a trailer hitch. Basically, I need to be able to change rear tires on this pretty easily. If I jack it up by the rear end, the rear tires will never droop out and I won't be able to get them off. So I added a little bar in between to jack the car up by. And if there's already a bar there, I might as well put a receiver hitch in it just in case. You never know. I might end up making a little rack for all my spare tires or something, so if I drive it to an event, I'll have everything good to go. But we'll see. You know, it's just another thing to add to the list here. All right, so that pretty much brings us up to date on, you know, the Mark III Golf Drift project. You know, it's been a ton of work already. There's a ton more to go, but most of the big ticket items are figured out and, you know, pretty close to being completed. There's just, you know, a handful of little things that we still need to make it functional, like mounting everything. But once that's all figured out, hopefully the next time you see this thing, it'll be out tearing it up. So yeah, see you guys in the next video.
What are you doing, Mike?
Trying to figure some stuff out. Not entirely sure what yet.